and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, the other day I was watching one of Ralphie's episodes. Yes, I do keep tabs on what the opposition is up to, and in this particular episode he was recounting a tale about how somebody unknown had spent an inordinate amount of money getting some kind of internet company to basically scope out his videos and produce a report on how many times he used a naughty word, and inappropriate content, I think, is probably the best way of putting it. What sort of inappropriate content? Some old guy in a flat cap doing video reviews from what appears to be a cave in the Isle of Man I have absolutely no idea. But it kind of got me thinking, and this is always going to be an issue when you do reviews. You're a blogger, a video blogger, or whether you write. Chances are at some stage you're going to annoy somebody. You're going to really sometimes annoy somebody quite succinctly, that they go ahead and do things like that, and it's kind of, I suppose, par for the course. But anyway, Ralphie seemed to be implying that whoever was behind all of this was attempting to get his channel shut down, which I think would be, you know, an absolute disgrace, really, to be honest with you. And I must admit, I mean, I haven't had anything, as far as I'm aware of, nobody's produced a report like that. I mean, I've had my issues, obviously, as everybody that does blogging has probably had from time to time. And I guess my problem is that I'll always be associated with the company I work for Gauntleys. And although this video channel has absolutely nothing at all to do with my work, certainly it hasn't got anything to do with my work since my boss inexplicably decided to remove all funding for it. But even so, you know, whatever I tend to say is going to have some kind of effect on the business. And it's all came to a head, I guess, for me about sort of 9 months ago, when I was actually off ill, and I got this flurry of text messages from a colleague at work saying somebody's complained about the images you've used on your video, and the boss has gone balmy and wants an apology and has taken all your videos and all your stuff off the Gauntleys Whisky website, or the Gauntleys Whisky Facebook page, I should say, and all hell's breaking loose. And so I was left with no choice. I obviously had to apologise, although I didn't know what had actually been said, and it wasn't until I'd recovered and gone back to work and actually looked at the supposed complaining email, which turned out to be nothing of the sort. In actual fact, it just happened to be from a lady from the PR department of a distillery that I forget now, saying that they couldn't retweet my tweet because of the picture. The image had a picture of a woman in a bikini, and it was just, you know, not their kind of content. And there was no complaint, there was no saying that, you know, I'm appalled or anything like that. It was just purely pointing out that they couldn't sort of put it on their channel. And yeah, it was just sort of, at the end of the day, you know, what's important about my show is the reviewing the whiskey, not the imagery. And so, since I've stopped using, shall we say, somewhat risky and outre imagery, I've had no more problems, thankfully. Touch wood. Excuse me. So, while we're talking about upsetting people, let's talk about today's whiskies. Yeah, it's time for Glenrothes. Yes. Now, I've been less than complimentary about some of their whiskies in the past, and as far as I'm concerned, they are indeed a fully paid up member of the Axis of Evil. And the rep that contacted me a couple of months ago now was fully aware of my impressions, and it's it's a bit of an odd one, really, because when I first sort of encountered Glenrothes, it was single cask bottlings. There were some beautiful old bottlings being released by Duncan Taylor, I think it was at the time. So we're talking, you know, early 2000s, and then I finally tasted the actual distillery bottlings, and I was really disappointed. I mean, the spirit was hard, industrial. It was, you know, in that kind of style of sort of, you know, Macduff and Dufftown and Glengoyne and a lot of these other distilleries that tend to use a considerable amount of sherry to cover up rough spirit, basically. And like I said, I was really surprised, and some of their bottlings, some of the distillery bottlings in the past have been, you know, not that great, shall we say. And so you're probably wondering why the rep has actually come and contact me, and the reason being is because, like a lot of distilleries, they decided to revamp their range. It was, you know, needed an overhaul, and now the vintage dates on their bottlings have now disappeared, and they've reverted back to a straightforward age statement, which is a bit surprising, but, you know, well, we'll kind of go with this. And so he's saying, yeah, okay, you know, I'd like to sort of, you know, see if I can change your mind. And I said, well, yeah, fine, no problem with that at all. I'll quite happily, you know, take a look at your new juice, so to speak, and as with everything, I always keep an open mind. And I said, yeah, I'll certainly do an episode of the show. So I'm doing an episode of the show now, because I've finally got the sample of the 25-year-old, which I've been waiting for. And it's going to be interesting, I think, because have they changed? Has the style of the whiskey changed? Chances are probably not. But, you know, like I said, we shall see. And, you know, the packaging looks quite good. It's quite smart. It's the same sort of dumpy bottles as they used to use, and there's the usual marketing guff going on. Maybe not quite so much as some other distilleries like Jura, for example, with their recent re-release, but there's a lot of guff about the sort of colouring of the label that equates to the grapes, and all I'm interested in is what is the liquid tasting like. I'm not really interested in what colour labels or boxes or what have you've stuck your stuff in. But so that's what we're going to have a look at. We're going to sort of have a look at the juice and see if it's the same old, or whether things have indeed actually changed. So guess there's not really a great deal much else to say apart from let's have a look at the new Soleo lineup. Right, okay, so yes, indeed, they've called it the Soleo. Don't know the entire reason behind that, but it's probably something to do with Solera, I imagine, and as you know, they use an awful lot of sherry. And we're going to kick off with the 10-year-old. It's bottled at 40%. And it's been aged in sherry seasoned oak. I mean, really, what does that actually mean? I'm guessing what it actually means is that they've had casks custom made, probably out in Jerez, and whichever the bodega that they use has probably seasoned them with, I think the technical term is Rias sherry. I think the sort of stuff that they use to season casks with, and has generally never tended to be bottled, or if it is, it tends to go into the cheap stuff. And I don't know whether it's first fill, refill. I guess from the colour, probably refill. But you know, it's that sort of, you know, guff, isn't it, really? Why not just come out and say it's refilled sherry casks that we've had made, you know? Or, but anyway, that's kind of marketing stuff for you, isn't it? Second bottling we'll be looking at is the 12-year-old, again bottled at a bit below 40%, and again matured in sherry seasoned oak. And Well, maybe looking at the colour, slightly darker than the 10-year-old. Possibly there's maybe a bit of first fill in there. I honestly couldn't say, but again, I would guess probably refilled casks of some form or description. Third bottling we'll be looking at is called the Whisky Maker's Cut. Now this is actually bottled at a slightly sensible ABV at 48.8 and is aged entirely in first fill sherry seasoned oak. You still with me? Okay, good. So yeah, this is obviously, as you can see, a lot darker in colour, and at least they've basically said this is first fill sherry casks. So I guess what they're trying to basically say is that these were not casks that were maybe in a solera for a number of years or used by whatever the bodega is. These are casks that they've, like I said, they've probably had custom made for them. The next bottling we'll be looking at is the 18-year-old. This is bottled at a slightly higher ABV than the 10 and the 12 at 43%. And again, sherry seasoned oak. And the guff on the label basically says a high proportion of first fill. What is a high proportion? I mean, why don't you just say, well, it's 50 or 60% first fill and 50 or 40% refill? Why not just just say what the sort of percentages are of the casks? I mean, it's not going to kill you, is it? But no, it's all supposedly adding a bit of, I guess, mystique, I suppose, for want of a better word. And the last bottling we'll be looking at is the 25-year-old. This again is bottled at 43% and aged in sherry seasoned oak and has a high proportion of first fill sherry casks. Anyway, like I said, all this kind of marketing guff aside, it's some people obviously get into it. I mean, otherwise, if they didn't, then the marketing departments wouldn't carry on doing this sort of stuff. But anyway, like I said, this is, I'm not obviously passing any judgment on marketing, packaging, anything like that. It's all about what the whiskey itself is like. So let's kick off with the 10-year-old. Right, okay, so let's see what the 10-year-old gives us on the nose then, shall we? Oh, that's hard. That's I mean, it's not especially fainty. It's not. It's just a bit rough. And the thing is with what I think is that if you look at the stills that Glenrothes has, they are fairly big and chunky and small necked. So you're going to get a fairly robust spirit, and I think it's obviously when you have a sort of a characterful spirit, should we say, characterful new make, it's going to need a lot more time in the oak to kind of remove all the unpleasant bits that the fusel oils and things like that you don't really want. Yeah, there's some sherry there, but it's got that kind of. It's not unclean, but it's rough. It's a little raw. Yeah, there's a touch of sherry. It's a bit. Yeah, there's not exactly an awful lot going on, it has to be said. It's pretty simple stuff. It's kind of, hard barley and a bit of sherry, really. I mean, it's got a reasonable depth. It's okay, but it's not the sort of whiskey that is going to sort of, give you orgasmic raptures, shall we say? Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Oh dear God, that's bitter. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but no, it is bitter. It's a little watery, it's a little sort of nondescript. There's some, again, it's really quite hard. It's an unyielding spirit, it has to be said. It is not exactly a flavourful, juicy kind of spirit. The sherry is a bit kind of, there's a little bit of dried fruit, a bit of raisins, a touch of spice possibly, but it's all pretty homogeneous. It's pretty bitter on the finish. I mean, the length is reasonable, if you like a lot of bittering oak, that is. But the problem is there's no inherent sweetness to kind of balance up that bitterness. And I mean, like I've said on more than one occasion, I don't mind a bit of bittering oak, and sometimes you want a little bit of bittering oak, certainly if you have quite a sweet spirit, just to kind of add a sort of a counterpoint. But this doesn't have any sweetness at all. In actual fact, it doesn't even have any sherry sweetness. It's kind of like a bit of a nondescript kind of dried fruit kind of character. And although I don't think this is retailing for a huge amount of money, it's certainly not one that I would kind of even remotely fall in love with. But there you go. That's the 10-year-old. Let's move on, shall we? Right, okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old. Let's see if a couple of additional years has made any difference whatsoever. Again, it's a bit... there's a little bit more sherry character going on, it has to be said. There's a little bit more of that sort of slightly herbally, oloroso-y sort of kind of character. Again, the spirit is a bit hard. It's not quite so sort of in-your-face hardness, because obviously there's a little bit more sherry character. But again, there's no huge complexity here. There's maybe a little bit of dried fruit, a little bit of spice, maybe a touch of earth, but it's all pretty unexciting stuff, it has to be said. I mean, the spirit itself isn't a bad quality, it's just a bit rough, you know, and I know that's, as you can see, that's obviously the characteristic of the distillery, and there are a number of distilleries that display that character, and there are a lot of people that do love that kind of, I suppose they would call it natural and raw and all this kind of stuff, you know. To me it's just a bit hard work, you know, and it's probably the 40% as well. I mean, it's just got no guts, you know. There's no intensity. It's all very, you know. And again, I get the feeling it's kind of been bottled at 40% purely to keep it within a certain price bracket. Nothing more than that. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. A pleasant, sweet, sherried aftertaste, less bitter, more sherry character. Again, it's got that hard industrial character. You can't, you just feel it underneath the sherry. I mean, it's not a sherry monster by any stretch of the imagination, although there is, like I said, there's more herbally, almost oloroso-y style sherry character. There's a bit of spice, a touch of ginger maybe. But again, it's quite watery, it's a bit vague, it's a bit, you know, it's kind of like, where's the power, where's the intensity? It's all very kind of, here I am kind of thing. And like I said, although it's not a very particularly bitter aftertaste, and it has some sweetness fleetingly on the finish, it's still not exactly a whiskey that I'm going to sort of like, you know, fall over myself to actually sell anybody. So, although not bad, not great either. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Whiskey Maker's Cut. So this is bottled at 48.8%. Hopefully this has got some guts. Let's see what the nose gives us. Now, I was expecting a sherry monster. I mean, this is all apparently first fill sherry, and it's pretty bland, really. It's kind of character sort of slightly between the 10 and the 12, it has to be said. It's got some slightly loamy, maybe a little bit more sweeter dried fruits. Yeah, maybe okay, so it's slightly edging, maybe a little bit closer in style to the 12. But again, it's pretty one-dimensional. And I can't really get an awful lot of spirit, which I suppose in essence is maybe not quite such a bad thing. And it's just indicative of these kind of whiskies that tend to use an awful lot of first fill, that you don't get any distillery character. And having, when you taste sort of like, youngish spirit from those distilleries, especially if it's been aged in American oak, you think, well, thank God I can't get any distillery character. It's got a bit of a fresh edge, I suppose, a little bit of citrus, and almost kind of sort of minerally note maybe, but again it's just sort of really quite boring, really, it has to be said. It's no fireworks, there's no sort of like, oh my God, this is incredible, they picked some amazing casks, this is a great vatting. It's just average, it's clean. I mean, that, now I will say that, I will say that about all three of these bottlings, no sulphur, no blemishes, so they've obviously really put the effort into the sourcing and the quality control of their wood. So it's not all bad, but yeah, touch of coffee maybe now, a little bit of stewed fruit maybe, But again, like I said, this is just all sherry character, and not a huge amount of it, has to be said, but sherry character nevertheless. Let's see what the palate's like. Now that's a bit more like it. It's got some intensity, it's got some spiciness. That extra ABV is just sort of like bringing out the spices. It's got ginger, it's got a bit of pepper, black dark chocolate, juicy sweet prunes, raisins. I mean, yes, it's all sherry character. I don't get any inkling of distillery character. Or it's got a bit of a hard aftertaste, it has to be said. So that's obviously the spirit kind of coming through on the finish. But it's kind of like, admittedly it's not the style of whiskey that is going to sort of excite me, certainly not at this kind of age. I mean, I'm guessing this is in and around the sort of like, I would say probably sort of spirit, probably between about sort of 8 and maybe sort of 13ish, something of that kind of ilk. It's not really sort of got a lot of sort of oxidation character. It's very much, like I said, all about the cask, and although it's completely blemish free and very clean, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that will really enjoy this because they love sherry matured whiskies, and they don't, it doesn't really matter what the distillery character is, as long as it tastes of sherry, I suppose, for a number of people. For me, I just want a little bit more, and it doesn't quite deliver it, has to be said. Okay, so let's move on to the 18-year-old. So like I said, this is now a bottle of 43% and has a proportion of first fill, but obviously probably a larger proportion of refill. Let's see what the nose gives us. Now actually that's not too bad a nose. It's got some juiciness, it's got some caramelised orange, it's got, yes, it's still got a little bit of hard industrial character, but it's not quite so noticeable. And this is always the thing with this style of whiskey, as long as there is some other factors that kind of balance up the industrial character, it's fine. I don't mind a little bit of it, but when it's all about that industrial hard spirit, it's just, not exactly sort of pleasant. There's a touch of toffee, a little bit of herbal oloroso-y sort of notes, treacle. again, raisinated fruit, a little bit of barley. I mean, you know, I think the balance on this is actually not too bad at all. It certainly sort of, you know, has the right amount of sherry character, if you ask me, for the you know, the balance between the hard character of the whiskey and the oak. But again, it's just lacking a little bit. You know, maybe this should have been bottled at, you know, 48% as opposed to sort of like, you know, 43. Maybe that would have given it that little bit more intensity, sort of bringing out a bit more spiciness. I'm guessing at the end of the day that this is probably what Gordon Motion didn't want. He didn't want all that sort of spice and what have you. He wanted soft sherry and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise he probably would have bottled it at a higher ABV. Or maybe it's just the powers that be said it's got to be at this. I don't honestly know. I have no direct dealings with Edrington at all, so I couldn't honestly tell you. But again, it's got a relative level of complexity. But you know, I mean, an 18-year-old whiskey, what's this going to be? What, about 100 quid? You know, I think of a lot of other whiskies for that sort of money that I would certainly want to try and sell customers, and this wouldn't be anywhere near the top of it. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Again, it's a bit underpowered. It's got some pleasant sort of milk and dark chocolate, a little bit of coffee, a little bit of spice on the middle. It kind of picks up a little bit on the middle and towards the finish as those spices start to roll in. Again, there's a little bit of hardness from the character of the spirit, which it just kind of works in okay with the oak. Now there's a touch of maybe cinnamon, a bit more chocolate on the finish. Maybe a little bit of ginger as well. Quite chewy, not too bitter. A little bit of bitterness, but quite balanced. So yeah, okay. It's the balance. I think is absolutely perfectly fine. It's just again, it's just lacking real intensity. And certainly 100 quid or so a bottle. You want intensity. You want sort of something that goes, I'm really worth £100, and I'm afraid that this just does not sort of tell me that it's £100 whiskey. I mean, perfectly well made, like I said, but it just lacks that sort of. Right, okay, and finally we're on to the 25-year-old. A minuscule amount of this, it has to be said, but then, you know, this is £300 odd a bottle. And the question is it worth £300 a bottle? Well, we shall find out. Let's see what the nose gives us. Now, that is a lovely nose. Yeah, credit where credit is due. It has that lovely sort of mature, Armagnac-y kind of old sherry character. There's even a sweet barley note as well. And after tasting this, I was just thinking, well, maybe this is it. Maybe Glenrothes really needs 20 odd years in cask to remove all the unwanted, unpleasant, hard character. Now, obviously, you know, a distillery can't do that. It is just not physically possible. So, anyway, but it's got some lovely dark chocolate, a little bit of coffee, a touch of violet, some really sort of sweet cinnamon spices, sort of cinnamon sticks, aromatic, velvety. It's lovely, it's beautiful, it's mellow. Now, like I said, again, not a huge amount of distillery character, but at this sort of age, now you're getting the secondary and the tertiary characteristics from the oak coming through. You're getting the oxidation character, you're getting the Armagnac-y kind of character, and so where you lose on the distillery character, you gain on the maturity and the mature oak character. And yeah, this is lovely, but I mean, again, I've tasted whiskies that will blow this out of the water, and they're a third of the price. You know, this really is not a £300 whiskey. I mean, for a £300 whiskey, I'd want to be in raptures. You know, I'd want to eulogise to the cows come home, and I'm afraid I can't. I mean, it's a good whiskey. Don't get me wrong at all. It is a lovely whiskey, but you know, and if you'd have said 100, 125, 150 possibly, I'd have probably said, yeah, that's a good whiskey for that money. But for £300, my God, I'd want more. But then, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm spoiled. Who knows? I mean, I don't know. I taste an awful lot of whiskey and an awful lot of expensive whiskey, and you know, like I said, this really doesn't say £300 to me. But let's see what the pal's like. Now that's lovely and mellow. I mean, 43% for that is actually pretty okay, because it's got plenty of character. It's got sort of juicy raisinated fruit, a touch of armagnac-y prunes, walnut shell, dark chocolate, spice, pepper, maybe a little bit of sweet barley right on the finish, a little bit of darkish honey, mouth filling, a little short possibly. It doesn't quite have the length that I was expecting, and you could argue maybe it doesn't quite have the complexity or the mouth filling character, but it is certainly quality wise really very, very good. No off notes, very little hard industrial character, no sulphur, so there's a lot to praise this whiskey, but then equally there's a lot to sort of say, well, 300 quid, it's not worth it. And this is always the huge conundrum with whiskey, and especially with old expensive whiskey, is that you taste it and you think, well, yeah, it's good whiskey, it's old, it's interesting, but it's not stellar, it's not mind-blowing, and it's certainly not worth the price tag. And this is just a classic example of that, in my personal opinion. I mean, there will be other people that completely disagree. I think this is one best in show at whatever the competition was it San Francisco or something of that kind of ilk, and I'm sure that that's the thing that, you know, I seem to have found it when you judge competitions, you know, the big old sherry monsters do tend to sort of, like, you know, come away with the spoils, because by the time you've got to that point in the day's tasting, your palate is getting really quite fatigued, and they kind of like sort of have more character than they would, you know, if you were tasting it sort of purely sort of on its own, or in a sort of, you know, setting like this. And but you know, it's not earth shattering in the slightest. It's good, but it's not that good. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Well, I think like I said, I think it goes to prove my theory that sort of Glenrothes whiskey is pretty hard and unyielding, which I kind of knew anyway, and quite industrial, and it just needs a lot of time in the cask to sort of remove that sort of industrial character, or you just blanket it in sherry, one of the two. The 10-year-old, yeah, I mean, that's it. It's kind of got all the spirit character on show, and it shows up its shortcomings. You know, 40% really, at the end of the day, doesn't really matter what ABV you bottle that one out. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be particularly interesting. It's not complex. So yeah, that's that. The 12-year-old, yeah, maybe that could have done with being bottled at a higher ABV, a little bit more sherry character, but again, it had the kind of distillery character, which, you know, is not going to sort of appeal to the likes of me. The Whiskey Maker's Cut, well, again, better intensity, obviously, because being bottled at a higher ABV. A little bit more sherry character, less distillery character, which is not a bad thing. But, you know, just again, fairly bland, not exactly sort of blowing me out of the water, it has to be said. So yeah, okay. The 18-year-old, well, okay, on the balance, better balance, not too bad at all. Again, probably underpowered at sort of 43%. I would like to have seen that at closer to 48 actually. I'd have liked to have seen a bit more intensity. It was all a bit, oh god, coming back at me. So yeah, it was just sort of, it was okay. And the 25, well, yeah, okay, so probably the most interesting of the entire range, but again, you know, I'm not forking out £300 for them. Well, it's okay, and I doubt very many other people are going to fork out £300 for it personally. I mean, there probably will be a lot of people that love Glenrothes and probably will, but you know, I think probably if I was going to sort of like go, I don't know, value for money wise, I mean, really difficult, because like I said, I don't think any of them are really worth their price tag. They all have their sort of like shortcomings. They also have their positives, it has to be said. But maybe I'd go for the 18. It did seem to have sort of like the better balance of any of them. And if you're thinking about sort of price to sort of quality ratio, then probably that would be the one that I would opt to go for. But you'd be twisting my arm, it has to be said. But anyway, there you go. That's this week's episode of the show. I hope I've obviously not upset anybody with this review. I mean, it's like I said, my views on Glenrothes and the other distilleries of that ilk are pretty well known. So yeah, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Now, as I probably said this last week and the week before, probably we're now getting towards the silly season, and episodes of the show are now going to start to probably be a bit fewer and far between. But bear with me, and obviously, you know, once we get the silly season out of the way, it will all be business as usual in the new year. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Feel free to leave comments on YouTube, Facebook, you know, wherever. And all I have to say is good afternoon and good ramming.